going to talk that much about blogging, but this is the topic of my blog, so it's related. I'm going to try to go pretty fast. That's pretty easy for me. I'll try not to go too fast. And then during the Q&A, if you guys have any questions about blogging or other things I didn't cover in my talk, feel free to ask about that as well. So I'm going to talk about how we should be communicating about psychology in particular. It's relevant for X5 and so on because we draw a lot on psychology. Given what's going on with replicability crisis or whatever you want to call it. So as you probably have heard, there's this crisis that was epitomized by Ioannidis, this article, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. And so today what I'm going to do is I'll give a little bit of background about why we're worried about false positives in psychology. And I'll do this very quickly, and I apologize for those of you for whom this is review and very, very basic. I'll talk about how we can recognize when research is rigorous, when we can be more confident in it, and what implications that has for communicating in psychology. So first, going back to like your undergrad research methods and statistics courses, we know that in null hypothesis significance testing, we might conclude that there's no effect, so we might say, oh, I guess there's no correlation, no difference between groups, or we might conclude that there is an effect. And if we conclude that there is an effect, usually that's because we've seen a p-value less than 0.05. That means that we can publish it. And if we conclude that there's no effect, we say it's not significant, often that means we can't publish it. So we're hoping to get p less than 0.05 so that we can publish. And this is crossed with the true state of the world, which we can't know. And I'm oversimplifying here, but the true state of the world may be that there's no effect, or maybe that there is an effect. So the two blue boxes represent congruence between our conclusion and the true state of the world. So if we conclude there's no effect and there is no effect, that's a correct projection. If we conclude there is an effect and we're right, that's a hit. But of course we can't know if we're right or wrong. Right? We only know which row we're in, but we don't know which column we're in. So it's possible when we conclude there's no effect, we hope that that's correct, it's a correct prediction, but it could be a false negative. It could be that actually there is an effect and we failed to detect it. That's one thing we should worry about, one kind of error. And the other is a false positive. When we conclude that there is an effect, but we're wrong, there actually is no effect. And these are easy to confuse, so I'll give you a little visual. Type 1 error, when you think there is something and there's not. Type 2 error, when you think there's not something, but there is. So a lot of this replicability crisis surrounds the claim that type 1 errors might actually be much more prevalent in the literature than we think, and that's what Ioannidis' claim was. So we all know that in psychology and in many other sciences, we set our alpha level, our critical p-value, to decide that something is significant to 0.05 or 5%. So doesn't this mean that the false positive rate is fixed to 5%? Why should we worry? That's why we have such a conservative alpha, is to prevent the false positive rate from being too high. The reason that that's not a safeguard is that the false positive rate is the rate at which you end up in this cell when you are in this column. So when the true state of the world is that there's no effect, 5% of the time you will conclude that there is an effect and you will be wrong. But we don't know what proportion of the time we're in this column. Maybe we're testing a lot of true hypotheses, true research hypotheses, in which case we're in the right column and the 5% doesn't apply. So 5% is just a proportion of the bottom left cell as out of the whole left column. So 5% of the time when there's no effect, we're going to falsely conclude there is an effect. But remember, I said that what gets published is the stuff on the bottom row. So this is the published literature, roughly, more or less. There's a few null results in literature, but very few. So what we really want to know is what's the proportion of things in this bottom row that are in the left cell, and we don't know that. Then that's not necessarily 5%. So, but is there any reason to think that it's much more than 5%? Well, there's some empirical evidence for false positives. I'm just going to focus on the reproducibility project results, but there's other evidence, other kinds of evidence, meta-science, literature reviews, etc. But the reproducibility project was done by the Open Science Collaboration. So they took 100 studies from psychology journals published in 2008, and they picked very prestigious, high-impact psychology journals, cognitive and social psych studies. They replicated the original studies. So the original studies, 97% of them were significant. And then they conducted their applications. They tried to be as faithful to the original study as possible. This was the distribution of p-values in the replication studies. Only 37% of them were significant by one criterion. If you change a criterion, it might go up to like 46% or so. for social sex studies in particular, it was even worse. So this is just one piece of evidence. It's flawed, it's not perfect, but there's other reasons, other sources of evidence, other reasons to think that the false positive rate in psychology is probably more than 5%. So some people have tried to say, well, replications might not be a good way to estimate the false positive rate because there's differences between the replication study and the original. Maybe there are moderators. And surely there are some, but the question is, can they account for this high rate of failed replications? And the empirical evidence so far suggests that this is not likely. So another multi-lab project that's undertaken by the Open Science Collaboration is the Many Labs projects. And these projects suggest that most results that they've looked at are not moderated by things like which university or lab did the study. They don't often find significant heterogeneity in the effects depending on who did the study, whether it's online or in the lab, and of course there are exceptions, but for the most part, these things are not moderating the results, US versus international, time of semester, or order in which the studies are done if there's multiple studies in one study. So I think that there are some mitigating factors, but there's not really any way to completely ignore these signs that we have a replicability problem and that our false positive rate is probably higher than we would like. So how did it get this way? I think one of the reasons that we're in this situation is that we haven't put enough safeguards in place. There's so many incentives pushing towards getting a significant result. So as I mentioned, there's publication bias. Journals don't want to publish null results. There's also the fact that scientists are human beings, and therefore we're susceptible to self-deception. This is a quote from Richard Feynman. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. My own research is on self-deception and self-knowledge, so this is a topic near and dear to my heart. And I think we like to think that scientists are going to be objective and so on, but as you guys know better than just about anybody else, how hard it is to reason accurately and not be susceptible to biases. So in addition to this human tendency towards confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, self-deception, there's a bunch of structural incentives that exaggerate this. You would think that the structural forces would actually mitigate our tendency to want to find evidence for our theory, but actually a lot of the structural forces exaggerate this tendency. So it becomes really easy to get a significant result even when there is no effect. And here's, again, oversimplified diagram of how this happens. So you do a study, you might have a particular effect that you're looking for. Did you get the effect you predicted? If you did, great, you can publish it. And if you didn't, there's still hope. So you can ask, well, maybe I didn't get the one thing I was looking for that I was most interested in, but maybe I got a gender difference, or I got a different pattern across the conditions than what I was expecting, but that's still interesting. So I can still publish it, I just need to do one thing, I need to hark, which is hypothesizing after the results are known, so saying that you did predict it when in fact you didn't, which if you're not familiar with the publication process in science, sounds terrible, it sounds like lying. It's something we literally taught our graduate students to do. We literally would put it in handbooks of how to do research. It's in Daryl Benn's article on how to write a good empirical article. It says, we're not interested in what you were originally looking for, we're interested in what you found, and go back and write the introduction that sets up the finding that you got. Okay, so if you at first pass, you didn't even find any significant differences anywhere, you can ask, well, what if I drop some outliers? Or what if I add in some covariance? What if I use a different subset of items for my dependent measure? Maybe there was a bad item. So if you can dig around, do these things, and find an effect, you can still publish. And what we call that p-hacking. If you're not familiar with p-hacking, there's a lot of great papers describing all the different ways that you can p-hack. And this, again, inflates our rate of false positives because it increases our chances that we can capitalize on chance. If you think of a study with 50 participants, if you drop 3 or 4 participants here or there, you're allowed to try different ways of dropping because there's different justifiable rules for dropping outliers. If you find, if you do that enough different ways, the odds at some point you'll find a false positive, your p-value will drop below 0.05, are pretty high, even if there's no effect. Okay, and if you can't do any of these things, you don't publish, you put it in the file drawer, it's not your fault, it's that many journals don't want to see it. So what this leads to is that all 3 of these first 3 boxes lead to publications, and those publications look the same because we say that it's okay to p-hack, it's okay to hark. In fact, journals often, I've had reviewers and editors tell me to go back and say that I predicted the finding that I got. So there's a lot of pressure on us to do these things. We're taught to do them. We're taught that not only are they okay, but we're supposed to do them. So this leads to a literature we can't tell the difference between evidence that's really solid, that we should trust, and evidence that is very likely to be a false positive, or at least we should be more skeptical of. Maybe it should still be published, but we need to know as readers and consumers that it wasn't achieved through this first path. Right now we can't tell the difference. So remember we talked about how the false positive rate is 5% when we're just limiting ourselves to the left column? That's not even true, because with p-hacking and other questionable research practices, we can actually get that nominal alpha level of 5% up higher. So even when we're just talking about the left column, we're no longer at 5% at the bottom and 95% at the top if we allow these practices like p-hack. Okay, so false positives are probably quite bad. We now know what practices are causing them. So why do people do this? This seems terrible, right? Besides the fact that we're taught to do it. I'm illustrating two approaches. One is cherries for cherry picking, the shorthand for p-hacking and publication bias and all those things. And the other one is a giant telescope, because the other approach is to do everything slowly and carefully and transparently, and that takes a lot of resources and a lot of time. So part of the reason that we do it the shorter way, the faster way, is because it feels like we're accumulating knowledge much faster. If I can do a study with only 30 or 60 participants, and then I can move on to the next one, and I've got a significant result, and I can publish it, it feels like I've learned something. If I tell you, no, you need to triple your sample size, then you're going to run fewer studies, and you're going to accumulate less knowledge. But the analogy I use for this is that the quick and dirty way, where it feels like you're accumulating knowledge, it's like if a builder said, I can build a lot of houses. I can't put plumbing and electricity in them, but I can build them really fast. Right? So the quick and dirty way, we end up with a lot of houses. The slow and difficult way, we end up with fewer houses, but my argument is that they're better and they're more worth having. So the knowledge that we produce, the slower way, is closer to actual knowledge. We should have more confidence in the results of those studies than the ones that take shortcuts. So I think what we're learning from all this evidence that these practices, these shortcuts, increase the rate of false positives, is that science is much, much harder than we thought. It's going to require more resources, more time, and we shouldn't expect as many discoveries and breakthroughs every week. Okay, so that's the background on false positives. Now I'm going to talk about what are some clues that a study was done rigorously that we should trust the findings more. And of course, it's a spectrum. Okay. So what do good methods look like? How can we tell the difference between a study that was done using the old-fashioned cherry-picking practices versus the more rigorous practices? Or if we want to do it the right way, what should we do? So one is have a large sample. I think this message has gotten out. I've seen a pretty significant trend, it seems like, towards larger samples in psychology. Here's an illustration of why a large sample matters. So on the x-axis is effect size. I've made all the effect sizes equal to a d of 0.4. So if you have two groups, there's almost a half standard deviation difference between the two groups. If that's your true effect that you're trying to detect, and you have 10 people per cell, your confidence interval is going to be huge. That's the top confidence interval. If you have 20 people per group, 30 people per group, etc., it becomes significant around 60 people per group, but you still have a very wide confidence interval that goes to a very, very small effect. So if you want to be sure, if you want to get an accurate estimate of the effect size, you need something around 100 people per group or more, depending on how much precision you want. If you have too few people per group and you don't p-hack, you won't detect the effect. So that's when there is an effect. What about when there's not an effect? Same thing, same confidence intervals, now centered around 0. So when there's not an effect, if you have too few people per group, you can't tell. You know that it looks like you didn't get an effect, but your confidence level is huge and includes very large effects, and you can't rule out a large effect. So even if you are interested in all results and you are interested in coming to a conclusion about those, you really need a large sample. Another thing that we've now found is an indicator or clue to a result being robust is if the p-value is small. That is, if the p-value is not just below 0.05, but much closer to 0. That's a sign that a result is more likely to replicate. This is what the p-curve is based on, the idea that the more significant the finding is, the more robust and likely to replicate it is. That ignores a lot of other potential flaws of the study, but at least that operationalization of that question is likely to be a true effect. And here's my little back of the notebook illustration of why that is. So in null hypothesis significance testing, we're testing the null hypothesis, which is the idea that the effect we observed came from the null distribution. So this is the null distribution. The effect is 0. If you run a study, you're going to get an effect close to 0 most of the time. Once in a while, you're going to get an effect to the tails by chance. That would be a type 1 error, false positive. So if we get an effect that's far enough in the tails, we can say, I can reject the null hypothesis that my effect came from this distribution. Okay, so we want effects that are more extreme from the tail. What we're actually saying when we're saying this is that we think this effect came from a different distribution that's not centered around 0. We think the true effect has a distribution somewhere other than 0, and that our observed effect came from this other distribution. So if we get an effect that's just below 0.05, that seems, if we just look at the first distribution, it seems like, yeah, you're going to get a lot of effects that are just barely in the tail, because tails are unlikely by definition. But we're actually making the claim that our effect did not come from this distribution, it came from this other one. And in this other one, we should get things way out in the tail of the first one very often. So it's a little suspicious when you see a lot of effects, one after another, that are 0.048, 0.047, 0.049. Because if they were coming from this distribution, and we're calculating the p-value from this distribution, they shouldn't be clustered right around 0.05. There should be plenty that are very, very significant. Okay, another thing that should make you trust a result more is if the study was pre-registered. This is becoming more common. This ties the researcher's hands. It says, okay, this is the specific hypothesis I want to test. This is the design I'm going to use. This is how many participants I'm going to collect. And this is the analysis that's going to be the key test of my result. And so that eliminates the possibility of p-hacking and parking. It should make us more confident. It doesn't eliminate the possibility for exploratory results. You can still explore your data. It's just going to be very clear to readers which part of your analyses were confirmatory and which part were exploratory, and they can calibrate their confidence in your results accordingly. Transparency is another thing that should make us have more trust in the results. So if the authors disclose other analyses they might have run, if they share their data, sometimes that's not possible, but when possible, that allows errors to be caught or alternative analyses to be run. All these things should make us have more faith in the result. And I've sometimes advocated that researchers should not only present their most beautiful result, which is what we were taught and trained to do in what journals before, but they should also present other ways of analyzing, testing the question in their data, and maybe present their most damning results, so that the reader gets a full sense of how consistent the data are with their conclusion. Another thing that should make you trust the finding more is if it's been replicated. Now, this is a tricky one, because as some of you may have heard, there have been cases recently where entire literatures with many, many replications have been called into question. So this was a headline from Slate recently about the ego depletion RRR. So it was a case where a pre-registered replication report with many labs involved failed to replicate the ego depletion effect. The ego depletion literature has over 100 studies in it. So you would think that ego depletion had already been replicated, that we could be very confident in it. But I think replications should be evaluated by the same standards as original studies. So we should trust all the repeated evidence in the literature to the extent that it has these other characteristics. So were any of the replications or conceptual replications, follow-up studies, extensions, did they have large samples? Did they have small p-values? Were they pre-registered? Were they transparent? To the extent that the literature includes a lot of examples of studies like this, all pointing to the same conclusion, that's great. But it's important to keep in mind that it is possible, and maybe even likely, that we have literatures with dozens and dozens of studies pointing to the same conclusion, but those individual studies don't have many of these characteristics, and it's possible that all or most of those could be false positives. So just because there's a large body of literature pointing towards the topic doesn't mean that it's necessarily sound. Another thing that is a sign of a good study is if it sounds like it to be true. So if it seems too good to be true, or it seems unlikely, it seems counterintuitive, I think it should be held to a slightly higher standard. We should be a little bit more skeptical of it. This is also supported by the prediction market that went along with the reproducibility project in psychology, where they had readers, before the results came out, they had people predict which studies were likely to replicate, and they actually bet money on them. And this tracked pretty closely which ones were successful and which ones failed. So just from reading a study, you might have a good sense intuitively of whether it's likely to replicate. And probably readers were using some of these clues, like large sample, very significant, etc. Okay, so last point, communicating psychology. This is actually pretty straightforward. I think that one thing we need to communicate when we talk about psychology, and it's not specific to psychology, this is true for many sciences. I think psychology is ahead of the curve in recognizing and addressing these weaknesses, but it's harder than we thought. We can't get knowledge in the quick and dirty way that we thought we could, which also means we need more grant money, by the way. We should be skeptical. We should be prepared to unbelieve things that we thought were absolutely set in stone because there were already 50 studies showing it. Your favorite result, the thing you've been talking about or maybe telling your friends about at dinner parties, that might not be true. We need to be okay with that. Your own result that you found 10 times might not be true if you weren't using these new practices. We should look for empirically validated indicators of quality, so some things I just talked about, could have a large sample, and now what counts as a large sample differs depending on the design. I didn't go into that, but that's true. Was it pre-registered, et cetera? If you see, I think pre-registration is a really strong sign of a solid study, although I think as pre-registration becomes more common, we're going to have to refine exactly what we mean by pre-registered. Confidence should be rare, and doubt should be the norm. I'm very shocked how often I see headlines and see people talk about studies as if they're definitive. Recently in the Washington Post, there was a description of a study with something like 26 subjects that was touted as definitive. So yeah, that seems really, really strange to me. And we need to be okay with this. It's not anything to be ashamed of. That's just how science works. And in one of my favorite quotes, Simine talks about this. I don't have time to read it, so I'll just put it up here for a second. But he talks about how being a scientist means that you live without knowing. That's normal, that's okay. Or, put more succinctly, in 538.com, Christina Schwanden wrote, "Failure is moving science forward is a sign that science is working." It's nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, we're taking our problems seriously, we're trying to fix them. And that's it.